of the Tech for Liberty program is that we have something called the Data for Justice Project. And I work with a technologist who does a lot of really amazing data analysis and builds data dashboards and uses data to advance some of the ACLU's other civil rights and civil liberties goals, particularly in the realm of policing and the courts.
So let's talk about policing for a second, because I think in the last year, we've had such an increased focus on talking about police methods, surveillance methods. There's been so much discussion in Boston about the BPD's gang database, and the city council is now tapping into that and asking tough questions to BPD about its efficacy and what it's really doing. I think others have heard about gunshot detection technologies that are popping up, or did pop up a while ago, but I think the regulation of those is being called into question more and more. And then just other general surveillance strategies. So could you tell us a little bit about trends you're seeing specifically in Boston or around Massachusetts with respect to kind of surveillance and policing, and any tensions or areas of concern that you think we should all, as citizens and community members, just be aware of and in tune with?
Absolutely. So the explosion in consumer side surveillance technologies, surveillance camera doorbells, Arlo cameras, there's a huge market now of all sorts of smart devices that are really effectively surveillance devices, is a little on the heels of an explosion in surveillance related products for government, for law enforcement. We really saw in the post 9/11 period, especially, a huge increase in federal funding, as well as state and local funding for a variety of government surveillance technologies, ranging from CCTV systems, surveillance cameras, which prior to 9/11, most cities didn't really have surveillance camera networks. All of a sudden, hundreds of millions of dollars coming from Washington, D.C. spread out throughout, cities like Boston, but really across Massachusetts and across the country, enabled local police departments to very rapidly scale up their surveillance practices. So, for example, the MBTA currently has over 5,000 surveillance cameras in its throughout its properties across Eastern Massachusetts. The city of Boston maintains hundreds of surveillance cameras in a network across the city. And this is relatively new stuff. This is not, the type of surveillance that was occurring prior to 9/11, but that's really just scratching the surface. In addition to surveillance cameras, we've seen cities, including Boston, but not just Boston, many other cities and smaller cities too, adopting license plate readers. So those are technologies that essentially allow the police to keep track of where everybody's driving and when, by automatically taking pictures of cars and their license plates, and then automatically converting those images into machine readable text that basically puts your car at a given place at a given time and creates a database full of that metadata that can be referred to later on in case the police want to know, who was in this neighborhood at a given time. If there's a license plate reader there, they can just go check the database and see, the list of cars that was in the area. Plenty of other technologies too. As you said, ShotSpotter is one of them. This is a technology that purports to be able to determine when a gunshot has been fired and to notify law enforcement immediately. There are a lot of issues with this technology. One of which is that in some cases, because it uses microphones, it has recorded human speech. There was a case in New Bedford where the gunfire detection system went off, but prior to the shots, the ShotSpotter system had recorded some people on the street talking to one another, and that information ended up being used in court. There are other technologies too, like facial recognition systems. So that's one of the big issues that my office has been working on lately, is making sure that the democracy, that the people are in the lead here, right? That we are the ones who are making decisions about whether we want these technologies used in our communities, and if so, by whom, right? By which different types of government agencies, and with what types of protections and limitations. So, to that end, we have passed 7 laws throughout municipalities in Massachusetts that outright prohibit any local government from using facial recognition technology, in part due to some of the racial bias issues, but also just because we've seen what countries like China, frankly, the Chinese government, the Russian government have done with this technology. And it's pretty dystopian, the capacity to track where everyone is going, who they're associating with, what they're doing through these network surveillance cameras that are all across our cities using facial recognition technology is not so much anymore a dystopian, fiction. It's real. It's now science reality instead of science fiction. And we would like to avoid living in a world where we sort of stumble into that kind of dystopian nightmare. So a lot of the work that we're doing related to the police use of these technologies is bringing some democratic controls, often at the local level, actually. So we're doing a lot of this work in Boston to ensure that, for example, the city council, informed by the public, is making decisions about what technologies are appropriate, what technologies aren't. And if we decide that certain technologies are appropriate for government use, making sure that there are policies and rules in place to protect the public interest and ensure that people's rights aren't being violated.
So let's talk about the old saying that is, well, if I'm not doing anything wrong, or I don't really have anything to hide, like, what's really the problem? So for those who don't know, Kade has an excellent TED Talk where you talk a little bit about this and the dichotomy of, or really kind of like the false dichotomy of privacy versus safety. And you get to have one or the other, but maybe not both. So how would you recommend that people think about privacy and kind of conceptualize privacy versus safety? And so much of what we've heard since 9/11 has been like, well, if you want to be safe, then we need all this surveillance. How would you recommend people think through that?
Yeah, I think one of the more dangerous ideas that has become almost a truism, unfortunately, in American society since 9/11, like you said, is this idea that we have to sacrifice our privacy in exchange for public safety. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, so, when I think about privacy, I don't think about secrecy, first of all. I think about control, right? So a good example, and this is something I said in the TED Talk, is like, when I tell my doctor something about my health, that's not a secret in the sense that, I'm not sharing it with anyone. I'm sharing it with my doctor, but it is private. I do expect that my doctor is not going to turn around and tweet about, my health conditions. So privacy really just means that I feel like I have control over who has access to sensitive information about me, right? It's not necessarily secrets. I might tell my wife my health situation too. I might tell some of my friends and my family, but again, I'm in control of that information, which is what makes it private. So when we think about this idea that the government has, been feeding us really for years now, that we have to give up some privacy in exchange for some public safety, particularly in the realm of terrorism, but now I think, it's kind of migrated and people talk about it routinely related to, everyday crime in cities and communities across the country. We're really missing out on some fundamentals, because fundamentally the technologies that give us the most privacy, so I'm thinking encryption technology, right? Technology that when you log onto your bank account, you see that there's a little lock in the corner of the URL bar. That means that that's an encrypted connection with your bank, so that if somebody's like sniffing your Wi-Fi connection, they can't just, scoop your password and your credentials. Encryption provides us both privacy and security, right? Those are the same thing in the context of encryption. The same is true with our communications. I use encrypted communication services, and that gives me both privacy and security. A lot of people don't know this, but probably the most insecure form of communication that we use, that many people use today, is plain text messages. So, if you have an Android and you use text messages, highly insecure. If you have an iPhone and you're communicating with someone who has an Android and you see the green message, that's probably the most insecure form of communication you could ever use, because it's relatively easy for somebody with like basic technical skills and some equipment to just sit outside your house and sniff all of those messages. They're not sent in encrypted format. They're just sent in plain text. And that's dangerous, right? I mean, if you're texting with a friend and saying, hey, we're going to Mexico today, we'll be back in 2 weeks. Can you take care of the cat for us? If there's someone outside sniffing your text messages, they know exactly when you're leaving. They can break into your house and steal all your stuff. That's a problem. So again, this is another illustration of how privacy and security are really the same thing. But there are simpler examples too. Curtains on our windows, right, provide us with both privacy and security. Locks on our doors provide us with both privacy and security. Fences are another good example of that. Privacy and security. You don't want people to see what you're doing in your backyard because that's a privacy and security issue. And so, the idea that the technologies that give us privacy are somehow going to harm our security is really faulty. On the other hand, a lot of the technologies that the government has been using and advocates for, even, technologies like the Ring doorbell camera system, those are technologies that invade our privacy and put us at security risk. So there have been a number of stories about various internet surveillance devices, internet connected surveillance devices getting hacked. There was just an example a couple of weeks ago, a company called Verkada, which manufactures internet connected surveillance cameras and sells them to, private actors, government actors. This company was hacked, and all 150,000 of their cameras that are in people's homes, one of them is even in a county jail. The hackers got access to all of those live video feeds. So, when you're bringing a device into your home that markets itself as a security device, it may actually be the case that you're bringing a device into your home that not only violates your privacy because you're, sending Jeff Bezos information about, what your children are doing and your patterns of life when you're coming in and out of your home, etc. But you may also be opening up the door to a hacker to access very sensitive information about you, your family, again, your patterns of life, etc. So it just so happens to be that the simpler technologies that protect our privacy are often the ones that also protect our security, whereas all of these surveillance schemes and data collection schemes, that the government and corporations are telling us we need to protect our security can be used to actually undermine not just our privacy, but also our security as well.
I know the ACLU has a press pause on face surveillance campaign. What is that about? What's the purpose of it? And, does the ACLU believe there is, some rationale for why we would need, face surveillance in certain circumstances? Or, what's the goal of the campaign generally?
So we launched the Press Pause on Face Surveillance campaign a couple of years ago because we're really concerned that, we've talked a lot about how much information we leave behind us digitally on our, our cell phones are keeping track of everywhere we go. People, I don't think, need to hear me do a big spiel about how much information we put out there that companies and governments are collecting about us every single day when we're using the internet and our phones. The danger of facial surveillance and other biometrics. So biometric just means something that's unique to you. So believe it or not, the shape of your iris is a biometric, the shape of your ear, the way that you walk, your gait is allegedly a biometric, your voice is a biometric as well. So some banks now, when you call, are using voice biometrics to confirm that, it's really you who's calling to access your account. But these technologies, including facial biometrics, face surveillance technology, are dangerous in a new way because they give corporations and the government the capacity to connect all of the information that they have about us, that they've collected through our digital devices, our phones and our computers, to our real world bodies and movements in physical space and our habits and activities out in the world. And I'm not the only person who's thinking about this. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg just last week put some post on Facebook about how he's so excited about the potential of connecting all of our real world activities with all of the information that Facebook has collected about us on the internet, obviously, he wants to make money off of this. In my view, it is kind of the final frontier of digital surveillance and digital tracking, because while you can leave your phone at home if you want to go to a protest without being tracked by the government or by your phone company, you want to go get an abortion and have privacy in that, transaction, you can leave your phone at home, but you can't leave your face, right? You can't leave your ears, you can't leave your voice. And so these are kind of immutable, many of them immutable characteristics that, again, enable the sort of crossing of this threshold from digital tracking to the tracking of literally everything that you do in your life, whether you're using digital technology or not. And so for that reason, we launched this campaign. The goals of the campaign are to educate the public and lawmakers about the dangers inherent to government use of this technology, to pass some municipal prohibitions on the government's use of the technology throughout Massachusetts. And like I said, we've now passed 7 of those laws, including in Boston and Springfield, 2 of the 3 largest cities in the state. And the third goal is to pass statewide legislation that will protect the public interest for the long term, going forward for everybody in the state. The legislation that we're supporting this session is not a complete ban on the government's use of the technology. We believe that there ought to be a different approach in terms of thinking about different uses of facial recognition. What I described before, what the government in Moscow and Russia, what the Chinese government is doing with facial recognition, we believe ought to be permanently prohibited in Massachusetts. That is to say, we don't think that it's appropriate to use facial recognition to track people on video, right? You've probably seen the film, those, what are those Matt Damon movies, the Bourne Identity movies?
The Bourne, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there's one scene in one of those movies where the, creepy evil spy agency, I think it's the CIA, is trying to find Bourne in a train station in London or something. And they use facial recognition to, they enter his face into this computer system and then use these cameras to scan this crowded train station to look for his image, to look for him in real time. The police in Moscow and by the way, they were trying to kill him. But, in real life, the police in Moscow, Russia, have been using facial recognition in concert with video surveillance cameras to identify people who have been attending pro-Navalny demonstrations, anti-Putin demonstrations, and then basically making a list of those people and then going to their houses and arresting them after the fact. So that's the kind of thing that we think ought to be prohibited. We don't think that the government ought to be using facial recognition in connection with video data, because the risks are too high in terms of, our ability to live a life that's basically not constantly tracked by the government, documenting our associations, our habits, our public activities, just in case someday that information becomes useful to somebody in the government. Again, that kind of technology is marketed as a security thing, but in my view, it's actually harmful to our security, because there are people in government, people who might have access to a system like that, who would abuse it, right? The Moscow case is a great example. There was a young woman, a journalist in Moscow, who was pretty freaked out about this facial recognition system that the government there was using, and decided to see if she could bribe a cop on the Moscow police force to give her information about herself. So she paid him the equivalent of like $300, and he gave her information from the facial recognition system about everywhere that the cameras had seen her over, a period of a couple of weeks. So if a cop is going to be bribed by this journalist, just imagine who else could bribe someone to provide information about the real-time location of someone, someone's habits and movements and associations in the past, stalkers, ex-boyfriends who want to, find their jilted lover, whatever. These are real security threats that could result from the creation of a surveillance system that is so totalizing like this. So we think that ought to be prohibited. There is, though, one narrow use that we think is appropriate, subject to the right judicial oversight and, guardrails and limitations in statute. And that is basically, if the police have a photograph of someone that comes from a video image that a human being has reviewed. So I'll give you an example. Somebody robs a bank, right? And there's a surveillance camera at the bank that got a pretty good image of the person's face as they were conducting, an armed robbery. We think that if the police want to have a human reviewer look at that videotape and then press pause and get a screenshot of a clear image of that person's face, they can take that information with some other information to a judge and say, hey, we have probable cause to believe that this person just committed an armed robbery. We don't know who they are. We'd like to try to find their name, and then take that image with a warrant and run it against databases like the driver's license database in Massachusetts to try to put a name to a face of someone who's suspected of a very serious crime. That, in our view, is very different from the use of the technology to conduct surveillance effectively, to locate someone, to track someone's movements and habits and activities over time on video. So anyway, yeah, that's what we're fighting for in Massachusetts right now. The other thing to know about this is that this technology is not just used by police. There are other contexts as well. So over the pandemic, for example, there was quite a bit of reporting about students across the country expressing frustration because they were being subjected to the use of remote proctoring technology. So this is like, you're taking a test, and because of COVID, you can't do it in a room with your classmates with the teacher watching to make sure that you're not cheating. So there's software now that schools are adopting that basically watches students while they're taking tests. And this software purports to be able to discern whether someone's cheating, right? And then will flag that to the professor or the teacher. Well, a lot of these technologies use facial recognition. And like a lot of technologies that are in use in other areas of government, some of these systems have really serious racial bias error rates. So, we've seen stories, for example, of Black students saying, I was already stressed out because I had to prepare to take this test. And then the computer didn't even recognize my face. So I had to open the windows and shine a bright light on my face in order for this computer to even recognize that I was sitting in front of it so I could take this test, right? So I was pretty alarmed about that. And so I reached out to the person who runs technology for the city of Boston's public schools and said, hey, are you guys using any technology like this? There's some real concerns here. And he wrote back and said, we can't because you guys banned facial recognition at the Boston City Council. So, there are other areas where these technologies are in use in government too. It's not just the police, and we have a lot of concerns about all of those different types of deployments.
Thank you for explaining that. I feel like you connected some dots for me too, because I was recently listening to a podcast that was talking about a movement generally to kind of separate out our online selves from our physical selves and our own faces, and to take this idea of the pseudonym, that we're used to on Twitter or Reddit, and actually make that an identity that you participate in an online economy with. So you would get your crypto would be attached to it. You would trade your NFTs or whatever they are, your whole kind of identity. And then as you participate in different opportunities online, whether it be a job, a remote this, it's all under pseudonym, so that your physical identity is separated out from that. And listening to it, I was just like, wow, it's hard for me to imagine how that would work in practice. But I think listening to you is helping me connect the dots about why there is movement in that direction, and why for certain people who are already kind of ahead of the game on encrypting everything they send and only communicating via WhatsApp or whatever it is, they're kind of way ahead and already saying listen, you need an online pseudonym, you need it to be separate from your face, and that's where we're going to be in however many years.
Yeah, I mean, what we haven't talked about yet is the corporate side of this, right? So one of the ACLU's current litigation cases in Illinois is a case where my colleagues are suing a company called Clearview Ai, which its business model is essentially to scrape every available image of a face off the internet. So, if you have a Facebook profile picture, you're probably in this database. Twitter images, images from people's workplaces. If you have a bio with a photograph on your company's website, you're probably in this system. And the idea is, they've scraped all these images, connected the images to the link on the web where they found the picture of you, and then are selling a subscription-based facial recognition system based on these images to other corporations and to government agencies like the police. So this, in our view, violates a state law that was passed in Illinois called the Biometric Information Privacy Act, which requires that private actors get consent from you before collecting your biometric data. Clearview did not get anyone's consent to do this. They just scraped everything off the internet. But there's another company now which does something very similar called Eyes, which is not just available to corporations and to the police, but is available to literally anyone who will pay a fee, a monthly fee, to access this technology. So yeah, I mean, increasingly, if our laws do not catch up to even commercially available systems like this, we are going to be living in a world where a creepy dude could take a picture of you on the subway and then 2 seconds later have your home address, your name, know where you work, be able to access your social media accounts. That's very frightening, I think, for a lot of people, and is not, I don't think, the liberatory kind of use of technology that we're all hopeful for in the future. So yeah, I'm very concerned about that, and it's something that we're trying to figure out.
So it looks like we have, a little bit more than 5 minutes. If anyone has any specific questions for Kade, feel free to put them in the chat. But maybe one thing we could turn to is, so we have different people from different organizations today, many of which are working toward social, criminal, economic justice. I'm wondering if you have any specific recommendations for organizations themselves or leaders within organizations about how they should think about protecting their mission and increasingly the specific populations they're working to serve in the face of all of these, data surveillance technology threats. Last week, we were talking about how especially small scale organizations don't even have capacity for like a media team or a comms team to develop a social media strategy. So how are you going to take on all of the data and surveillance issues that you're talking about, especially knowing the population you're working with is feeling the burden of them the most?
A couple things that are relatively straightforward. One is that you should treat email as a public entity. Email is also highly insecure. The case last week about the oil pipeline company that was hacked and subjected to a ransomware attack or whatever that was probably an example of phishing, PHISH, phishing, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. People are getting very good at doing this, social engineering mixed with phishing, the idea that you could look up information about me. I get very, very specific targeted phishing emails every single day, right? People sending me stuff that's like, hello, I'm a doctorate student at the University of Ottawa, and I've been reading your work and I really appreciate it. I've attached this paper that I wrote about surveillance that I thought you might be interested in, and attached a PDF, right? I would never open a PDF from someone I don't know. I would never click on a link from someone I don't know in an email, because that is the easiest way for someone to get inside your server, to get inside your email system, and to basically like take over your entire organization's digital systems. So one thing I would do is remember that email is highly insecure. And we have a saying in our office that like, if you write it in an email, you better be comfortable with reading it in the Boston Globe. So that's one thing, is like, don't say things in email that you wouldn't be comfortable with reading in the paper. And the other is do some education with your staff and your community about these phishing schemes, and make sure that people remember that ensuring that your systems are protected, security is actually everybody's responsibility. It's not just the responsibility of your IT people or, you know, the folks who you contract your IT work out to. It is the responsibility of every single employee who has access to an email account that's connected to your system. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, and frankly, to be paranoid, right? Like, more paranoia in that regard is better than less. You know, if somebody sends me a link to a story and I don't know them, I'll write back and say, you know, can you send me that in the text of the email? Or I'll just like look it up, right? Google the article myself to make sure that I'm not being led down some, you know, creepy phishing trail. The second thing that you can do is to use encryption services. So the technology that I use, that we communicate with at the ACLU, is called Signal. It's a free app that works for both Androids and iPhones. It encrypts your communications via text, video call, and audio call. So you can do a lot on Signal securely. And then the third thing I would recommend is to use technology that encrypts your online activity so that your internet service provider isn't able to track everything that you're doing on the internet. You can do two things to effectuate that. One is to use a virtual private network, a VPN. A lot of people are familiar with those. And the other is to use a free service called Tor, T-O-R, which is a project that essentially is like a free VPN, but it's like inside a web browser, basically. So those are the top three things I would recommend.
Well, so for those who are feeling a little on edge now, don't worry, we have Trey Hanbury coming in next, who's going to do a whole session here on data security and privacy and precautions. So don't worry, it'll be okay. So maybe, Kade, there's just one question from Samantha in the last couple of minutes here about if there's anything else about racial bias and facial recognition software that you'd like to, you know, leave the group with, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So right here in Boston, actually, some research that was published, I think in 2018 by then a doctoral student at the MIT Media Lab, Joy Bulamwini, working with some colleagues, Timnit Gibru and Deb Raji. They showed that a number of facial recognition systems that are made even by some of the most prominent technology companies in the world exhibited high rates of error when trying to classify the faces, specifically of dark-skinned women, so Black women, but also had higher error rates for darker-skinned men, whereas the technologies worked almost perfectly for white men, for light-skinned men. And because of that research, it really opened up a huge new area of work that was taken up by even the federal government. So then in December 2019, kind of inspired by that study that came out of MIT earlier, which is called Gender Shades, by the way, if you're interested in looking it up, it's a really good study. There's a lot of information about it on MIT's website. The federal government then looked at this problem too and found essentially the same thing on a much more massive scale. It looked at about 200 facial recognition algorithms made by companies based here and all over the world, and found that pretty consistently these algorithms performed more poorly, had a harder time classifying, identifying the faces of darker skinned people and women, but not just them, also children and elderly people. So effectively what they found is that facial recognition algorithms really only work consistently for one tiny demographic of people, which is middle-aged white men. And that's not most of us.
Well, I'm sure that'll keep evolving and we can all continue to put pressure on society and our government and our local governments to work through that and be accountable. So thank you for sharing this morning, all of this wisdom and knowledge. And I appreciate your time and just want to once again thank you for being here and encourage everyone to go check out Kade's TED Talk and of course to support the ACLU.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to Kade and Courtney for taking time out of their busy schedules today. Really appreciate that. That was a really wonderful presentation, eye-opening for sure. And I was just back and forth with our next presenter, Trey Hanbury, and we were saying this is a really great segue into his presentation. So Trey is he's a partner at Hogan Lovells in DC, and he's been joining us since the very first sessions we did with the Road to Equal Justice. And he's here today to provide a useful presentation on digital security, including the current capabilities of law enforcement and companies to monitor and track you. This includes a lot of the issues that Kade just raised, including the facial recognition software and the data on our cell phones and steps we can take to protect ourselves. In our other presentations, organizations have been asking for a longer presentation from Trey. It was just too short and he has too much valuable information. So we've given him a little bit more time today. So Trey, please take it away, sir. And thanks for joining us again today.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Courtney. It's great to be here. And it is a great segue, I think, from the prior presentation. And a lot of those issues are real and important in a way that won't be readily solvable by one policy or one decision or one technology. And so the presentation that I'm going to deliver to you today really takes the surveillance state almost as a given, that it's even if we've got an aggressive state or federal legislative policy program in place, that it's really difficult to outrun the technology and get ahead of it. And so the presentation is about what can you do within the context of essentially a surveillance state to protect yourself against it and your organizations, which I know was some of the questions that you had. But part of answering that question, which is a really practical one and a really important one, it requires a little bit of review of the technology itself, both what it can do and what it can't do. Because a lot of times we think we're doomed because it's so all-encompassing technology in our lives that it's very difficult to understand what those limits are. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about what the technology can and can't do, and then about the policies that are existing today and the technologies, some of those that were mentioned, like Clearview or a few others. And then what can you do from a very practical sense within that context to combat it? And so I've got a few slides that I've worked up, which I will share now, try to anyway. See if we can, I'm a little crazy with the graphics here. Hopefully this is showing up on the screen. I don't know if you can see that, Tim.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, good. Let me get that up there. Make it full screen. Okay, so fun. I did kind of a matrix theme because I couldn't think of anything more all-encompassing in terms of the technology than that, but it provides a good backdrop. So 1 second, let me minimize my screen here. Okay, so one of the first things that I would like to talk about is just mobile technology. I work a lot in the mobile space, and when it comes to knowing who you are, where you are, what you can do, nothing's more important than your phone. And so I want to talk about how that works from the mobile technology standpoint. It's critical, say, during a protest, when the George Floyd protests were happening last year, we definitely saw a lot of activity around jamming, tracking, and surveilling. So I want to talk a little bit about what you can do and what you can't do. Also became relevant on January 6th, too, as people stormed the Capitol. What do we know about them? How did that work? How are the police and law enforcement approaching that activity, and what tools are they using to get at it? The next topic, big picture topic, is data and data aggregation. The prior presentation touched on some of that, but I'll talk a little bit about facial recognition, body-worn cameras, and data integration. And then the last bit of the presentation is really fighting back. What can you do before, during, and after a protest? I don't spend too much time talking about systemic things that you might want to integrate into your daily activities. Phishing, combating phishing is really important, but I don't spend too much time on that. Instead, really focus about how within an active protest society, one where you're making your voice heard, what can you do just from a real practical sense to avoid being surveilled or tracked when you don't want to be? Okay, so first step is on jamming. Phones are a critical piece of the equation in organizing any protest, and jamming is by law, local law enforcement in any case, flatly prohibited. That there should be no state or local jamming of your cell phone at any time. It's multiple provisions of the US code, some of which are listed here, prohibit that. And while federal officials can jam, they have that power. When it comes to state or local law enforcement, it should never happen. It certainly shouldn't happen by any commercial enterprise or business, because the law flatly prohibits it. Now, there are limited exceptions if you're a federal government organization, because the FCC doesn't have jurisdiction over those types of agencies, but it is unambiguously unlawful for state and local government to do. And so that would include cellular phones, PCS, radar detectors, GPS. It's a very robust prohibition. And so you should be empowered to use your phone no matter where you are. And local police telling you otherwise, that they have some right to jam, is flatly untrue. All right, so now that we have that out of the way, the other interesting thing is what to do about tracking. What can be done, and how does that work? Well, about 2/3 of all 911 calls come from wireless phones, and these calls are as likely to come from indoor as outdoor locations. And so what we've tried to do over the past 20 years is to get better and better location accuracy from your phone. And there are a couple of different tools that we use to get better location accuracy. When it first started, it was just a base station, and the base station could be pretty far away from you. And so if you only know that you're connected to a particular base station, you might be many, many kilometers away from that base station. And of course, you could be anywhere within the zone of that signal, which gives a huge area. Now, what operators quickly realized is if we could triangulate, if we can identify 3 base stations near you and identify your signal, we can try to pinpoint where you are from time of arrival to each of the base stations in that triangle. And that's pretty accurate, it turns out, but not super accurate. Depends on how close the base stations are. But say 30 to 1,200 meters, it's not so bad. About, 15 years ago, GPS started to see widespread incorporation into cell phones. That varies too. GPS is a system of satellites that orbit, and it emits a very faint signal, but one that can be heard even by phones. And that time of arrival, again, is used to identify a particular location on the planet. That's because it's synchronized with atomic clocks. And depending on atmospheric conditions and other factors, we can more or less calculate where you are if you're outside and if you have a pretty decent view of the satellites overhead. So not excessive clutter over top. And we can get within less than 10 meters of accuracy. Pretty close, but if you're in a big crowd, there might be a bunch of people within that 7.8 meters, 10 meters, give or take. So what can we do to get even more accurate? Well, we can use all those Wi-Fi hotspots, because a lot of those are mapped and we know exactly where those are. And so we can use the same kind of time of arrival technique. If we know that your phone is pinging that Wi-Fi hotspot, or it's pinging you and showing up on your iPhone, for instance, we can position you pretty close to that Wi-Fi hotspot. If that location is known, we can bind that with the base station information, the GPS signal, and we can start to get some pretty good accuracy, 3 to 5 meters. We can now even use beacons and barometers. Now, your phone actually incorporates a barometer, so we can tell the atmospheric pressure that is being read by your phone, and that helps give us even greater accuracy. And we can use things too, like Bluetooth. So if, the same way we do that with the Wi-Fi signal, Bluetooth is a much shorter range technology, so we can start to get even more accurate sensing, to the point where now with these different technologies, we're looking at 3 dimensions, not only X, Y, sort of latitude and longitude, but we can get to the Z axis, the horizontal axis. So we'll know not only that you're in the building, but we'll know what floor of the building you're on. And there's actually an order that was adopted last year that says that all nationwide wireless providers have to deploy some form of Z-axis technology. Basically, it's either a barometer incorporated in the phone and all the technology that goes into reading that from a network perspective, or it's a beacon. So there'll be a series of beacons that are deployed throughout most urban areas that will penetrate a building, allow you to read what your altitude is above ground. And those are actively being deployed now, and that will give us a very accurate picture of where you are. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just the wireless operators either. Google actually can do the same thing because it has mapped all of those Wi-Fi access points, and it has good information about Bluetooth. So even if you don't have a wireless phone, or even if you're not connecting to your cell phone carrier, if you're just using your Wi-Fi, Google can do pretty much the same thing. They give a map display radius for each location based on all of their readings and mapping of Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. And they say that within that radius, which can vary, it's usually about 10 meters, it's accurate about 68% of the time. So it's not perfect. Your wireless carrier will be able to get much better and more accurate data, but Google and other providers can do this too, because they have mapped the world, including the Wi-Fi hotspots and the Bluetooth devices, and they're able to collect that, aggregate the data, and then pinpoint a particular Gmail address that's associated with a particular phone. So is that good or bad? So I'm not really making normative judgments about what we should do, but it could be a good thing. For instance, there were a lot of advocacy and voter registration groups that were gathering data from the protests in 2020 by tracking cell phones of participants and sending them messages about registering to vote or taking other actions. One user called it deeply spooky, yet extremely helpful. And I think that probably about sums it up, because you're tracking individuals through location data gathered by apps on their phones or potentially through the carrier. And that kind of geofencing could be a really powerful political organizing tool, but it could also be a great way to track people. So for example, going back to the Capitol event on January 6th, one of the things that the Capitol Police and other law enforcement agencies did was to geofence the Capitol. That place is wired with Wi-Fi. The cell phone coverage is actually a little bit spotty in many parts of the Capitol. All those marble buildings and statuary does a great job of really blocking a lot of the cell phone signals. So what the Capitol Police appear to have done is sent a warrant to Google and told them, hey, produce everybody who was in this geofenced area in the vicinity of the Capitol. And then they created a whitelist of who was authorized to be in the Capitol, say members and their staff. And then they compared the two, and anyone who wasn't on the whitelist suddenly is the subject of law enforcement scrutiny. Now, some privacy advocates have raised a lot of questions about that. So what about medical personnel? What about journalists? They might not have appeared on that whitelist. And so is the incremental unwanted scrutiny worth the risk? I think that's a question for the ACLU and others to decide, but certainly it's possible that journalists could feel impinged in their ability to cover an event if they feel they're going to be the subject of additional scrutiny as a result of a fairly indiscriminate kind of dragnet approach to the geofence technology. So as our prior speaker mentioned, a lot of this information too is available to anyone. So your groups, for instance, could acquire geofence data as a way to target new members or to generate additional social activism. It can also be used by law enforcement. So it is, in some sense, neither good nor bad, but it is out there and it is a very powerful tool. So let's go to talk here a little bit about E911 and how this works. I think we've covered that, but let's go to surveilling. And this is another interesting phenomenon. It's one that we really saw, I think, a lot of in 2020 in the George Floyd protests, but it's probably still relevant to you. So there are these devices. Well, there's such a thing as an IMSI. It's a unique identifier that's associated with your phone. And the police have the ability to essentially drag a suitcase-sized box and set up a phantom cell phone tower. And that cell phone tower will be very powerful for any phones in the vicinity. And what your phone does is try to look for the most powerful tower so you can get the best connection. And so when it sees a really powerful signal from this phantom cell phone tower that the police may have erected, it's going to connect to it. And that's a great way for the police to intercept your communication and identify your IMSI, which is this unique identifier that can be traced to your number, and it can understand who you are and how long you are on the phone, who else you're calling, the number that you've dialed, can even get your serial number, the duration of the call, can understand the cell sector that you're reaching. And these devices have all kinds of different names. You probably have seen some stories about them. They're sometimes called IMSI catchers. Sometimes they're known as stingrays, or a cell site simulator, or a triggerfish, or gossamer, or swamp box. They've got a lot of different names. And with that many names, you would think they would be very well established in the law enforcement community. And in fact, they are. They cost less than $150,000. And many, many law enforcement agencies throughout the country have these units because they're so inexpensive. And often they've been subsidized by federal grants. So these types of devices are a powerful tool for law enforcement to use against public protest. Now, there are some important limitations, and this is kind of where we get a little bit into the technology, not too much. More advanced networks, so you've probably heard of 5G or 4G, those encrypt their communications. They have pretty strong signal encryption, and it acts as a barrier for law enforcement to intercept that technology. But these IMSI catchers actually work on 2G technology. Many of the major carriers are shutting down their 2G networks. So Verizon's supposed to shut theirs down next year. T-Mobile's is supposed to shut down theirs at the end of this year, because the new technologies are much more powerful. They carry a lot more data. They're cheaper to run. So all the carriers are slowly transitioning to 4G, 5G networks. But some of these, 2G and 3G networks, the 3G network, in the case of, 3G networks are less secure. And what's interesting is you might be connected to a 4G signal, but because the signal is powerful enough, you can actually down convert. So when it can establish a good connection to your 4G or 5G network, it'll look for the next best thing. And a lot of times that will be the less secure, less powerful 3G network. And so even if you feel like you've got a 5G phone, it doesn't mean that you can't be knocked down to a lower level of encryption. And then you're just as vulnerable to these IMSI catchers or stingrays as anyone else using a less sophisticated handset than you might have. So don't think that just because you have the latest iPhone or the latest Android 5G phone that you're home free. So there are tools, for instance, in a Android phone, you can disable 2G and 3G services, and you can say, I only want to operate on 4G and 5G, and there's a fairly easy switch that you can do to protect against that. And that's probably not a bad idea, because the 4G and 5G signals will encrypt some of this information, this identifying information, in a way that makes it a lot harder to track you. And that could be viewed as a very positive thing. It does require a little bit of foresight, a little bit of anticipation about how you operate and move within the world, but might be a worthwhile precaution to take. Okay. So I think our last speaker covered a lot on the warrants, and I know we're going to be up against time. So I'm going to skip the warrant issue and go to facial recognition, where I know we touched on that in the last presentation as well. But let's do some level setting and we'll talk a little bit about what can be done. So as of 2019, we've got about half of all American adults who are currently in a law enforcement facial recognition network. That's probably increased since then, but those were the best numbers that I could find. And many of the most sophisticated technologies rest with the federal government. There have been vast improvements. Just to give you an example, and show it here in the second bullet, 2010, the error rate was 8%. 2018, it was 0.3%. And that's not to take anything away from what the last speaker said. There are a lot more false positives if you're a person of color or if you're a woman. If you're a middle-aged white guy like me, get pretty accurate. So that could be, it's just a reality, and I think it's one that the industry is striving to address. But it may sometimes be better to have that anonymity than not. There are limitations, very practical ones. The lighting can be bad, the pictures can be low resolution. Several communities, San Francisco, Boston, they've barred the use of facial recognition as a law enforcement tool, but there are a lot of tools out there. And so we've got a very dynamic environment, and one that is drawing from a larger and larger pool of information. And so one of the biggest pools of information actually is body-worn cameras. Originally, these were hailed as a way to police the police and to protect against abuses of authority. And so there were smart policing initiatives, grants. They've given more than 20 million to provide body-worn cameras for law enforcement throughout the country. And the ideas represented in this case I give you here, Floyd versus City of New York, was that they're going to provide this contemporaneous objective record of stop and frisks, and that everyone's going to have more mutual respect and more lawful interaction. And so right now, or as of 2019, again, the best data I could find, we've got about half of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country have some type of body-worn camera program, though a lot of them are still in the pilot stages. So what's really interesting, though, is the potential to combine body-worn cameras with facial recognition. And that means that essentially every law enforcement officer is an observation point for a government-controlled camera. And that, combined with real-time facial recognition, redefines public spaces and really destroys anonymity as a value that you might enjoy otherwise without these types of technology. And so based on current technologies and how they're deployed and where law enforcement is, it's pretty likely that the greatest burden will fall on the minority communities where police and body-worn cameras are the most prevalent. And so these types of intrusions into the public space and into public anonymity really do create new and different concerns that we should all be aware of. And there are a lot of, I think, solid recommendations out there on how to improve the outlook for individual liberty when you've got body-worn cameras combining with facial recognition. One would be, well, don't allow it, limit data, facial recognition collected from body-worn cameras. Provide notice, that seems like a reasonable thing. So if you've got police in your community that are having body-worn cameras and that have facial recognition, notify people so that they can be aware, and then limit the retention of that footage so it doesn't become another image to upload into the enormous and growing databases of both public and private companies or entities that can draw from that footage to cross-reference and identify individuals. You could limit data sharing. And of course, you could establish some kind of independent oversight of police use of that facial recognition data, because there could be very valuable, in fact, there inevitably will be very valuable data that could be useful in solving crimes or identifying police misbehavior. But it's significant in terms of the risk that it poses to the individual and individual liberty. So talked a little bit about these issues, and I think that last bullet I think probably worth spending just a minute on. At present, all of these body-worn cameras and facial recognition, it's pretty much a regulatory void. There's not a lot of federal legislation on the books. State and local legislation is sketchy at best and incomplete. And we're really at the precipice of, actually we're past the precipice. You know, this is out there. It actually exists. And so once again, we're kind of running to catch up with the technology. And so we should be thinking about, well, what do we do with a world where facial recognition is a reality and an event that's likely not going to be outlapped or outpaced by local, state, federal laws or restrictions. So more on that in a moment. But let's go to that other key component that the last presentation touched on, database integration and search. So the real power of something like facial recognition is, go to the data integration side, it's about combining all that information, taking the location data that you gain from your cell phone or from Google's inventory of Wi-Fi hotspots so that we know exactly where you are and what your phone is doing and how long you're talking to people. Combine that with your visual identity, your images that are collected from local surveillance cameras, the grocery store footage, the body-worn cameras by the police. Combine all of that with consumer information that has biographical information, such as your credit rating or your birthday, your employment background check reports, which might have your past addresses, professional licenses, criminal history, your commercial records, so we know your banking history, and then combine that again with the cell phone data that I mentioned, so we know where you're going, where you went yesterday, where you went 4 weeks ago, how it differs from where you went before. Now, combining all of that, all of those different databases has been an aspiration for many years, but there are now a lot of companies doing just that. And there is one in particular that I spent some time on in this presentation. They're not alone. It's Palantir. You may have heard of that. They are a database aggregator for national security organizations and law enforcement. And they really control the vast majority of the government market. They went public not long ago, and their stock is up and down. In fact, they're actually being, they're not exactly outperforming the markets, in part because of perceived weaknesses in marketing to ordinary businesses and consumers, where companies like Salesforce do a much better job of marketing to the commercial market. So there's a lot of investor pressure to get them to expand beyond their core government users to a more commercial orientation, so businesses and individuals. We'll see what role they play there, but you know, just as an aside, so we have a little bit more time, you know, the Palantir name, it's funny. I think if you have a startup, and this is a pretty big startup, it's no longer a startup, but if you have a startup, you have to name it after a Lord of the Rings item. So this particular one, if it sounds familiar, it's the Palantiri, were those indestructible balls of crystal that were used for communication and to see what events were happening in other parts of the world of Middle Earth and Lord of the Rings, whether they were past or future. You could look in there and see it. So that's kind of what they purport to do, is to really integrate all the information into one source and make it easily searchable. And so what's in Palantir, or what does Palantir offer? Well, you know, we've got some information from training manuals for the LAPD where this information came out. So it would include, for example, warrant information, arrest information, dispatch information, witness interviews, DMV information, automated license plate reader data, toll booth photos, traffic camera photos. Basically, there was one There was one, you know, I'll come to this in a second. There was one person that says, you know, if you've driven through LA since 2015, the police can see where your car was photographed, when it was photographed, and then click your name to learn all about you. And so the reason I have this search evolution history, you may remember, I don't know, I remember Ask Jeeves, I remember Lycos and Alta Vista, maybe I'm showing my age, but you know, Ask Jeeves was a really great search service. The idea was, hey, we're going to curate the internet for you. We will be your personal butler. We're going to go out and fetch that information and bring it to you based on what we think will be relevant. And it worked pretty well. It was a lot better than a lot of the other search engines in my view, but it ultimately was eclipsed by Google because Google really focused on calculations, not that they dreamed up, but on what was relevant and what was the crowd really interested in? Who were the relationships among the links? What links link to other links? What are more geographically proximate to you? And it operated on a device agnostic way. And that's kind of what Palantir has done too, so that it gets away from the individual databases or even trying to anticipate what you might search for, and instead provides a Google-like experience across multiple databases. So for example, if you wanted to type in male, white, Vineland boys, rosary tattoo, you could search all of those databases and find out, you know, that there's an individual matching that description who had a witness interview 4 years ago and drives this car. And so you can do that kind of relationship matching, which is a really powerful tool for law enforcement or national security personnel, and really does get you down into the weeds and integrates those government databases so that it's not individual silos, but allows for the pooling of resources so that you can uncover patterns of activity that underlie security threats and criminal activities. Now, that's how supposedly Palantir helped find Osama bin Laden, to map these sort of subtle relationships and layer upon layer with databases to get at that information. But they also provide service to ICE and DHS and other domestic law enforcement agencies on the federal level, mostly, and provide a really powerful tool to map a person to a car, a person to a home, a person to a crime scene. And one of the big criticisms about this information presentation is that they're treated as almost fact, and they're presented really without a caveat. And that could lead to some excessive oversight or excessive scrutiny of particular individuals. And so that raises a lot of questions about how that's going to work. You know, again, they're mapping to relevance, but you get a lot of data. And I think one of the great features of Palantir, and others have this too, is that you can figure out not only the different data in kind of its rawest form, but it can be presented in a really friendly user interface that allows for click-through type of accessibility. So a lot of questions. What about systemic manipulation of crime statistics? You know, what happens to predictive policing when police data records are, you know, including falsified crime or planted evidence or racially biased arrest? What other kinds of dirty data are going in to the system? And so it kind of goes back to the old adage of garbage in, garbage out. So taking all of this as fact, or allowing that veneer of rationality of this type of cross-database information to prevail, might just push police to the same, you know, to even extend the kind of over-policing and over-criminalizing of different communities that already exist. So instead of garbage in, garbage out, it could be a bias in, bias out model of predictive policing, and that's potentially the concern with systems like this. But they are very powerful tools. They're out there. Palantir is not alone. The last presenter mentioned Clearview Ai. You know, they indicate, their internal documents indicate that more than 2,200 government agencies and private businesses have tried the service. A lot of that's because you get a free 30-day trial. But they claim to have 600 customers in law enforcement. and it depends on who you're listening to about who those agencies are, but Immigrations and Customs Enforcement is also supposedly one of their customers. When I think about all of this, and we're going to get to, I want to be mindful of the time because we're going to get to the sort of how do you combat this so you just don't have this doom and gloom image. But I did want to say that on Palantir, because I'm a Lord of the Rings geek, you may remember that it was Saruman who was once a good person. He became allied with Sauron, the bad guy, so he became an evil ally, in part because those crystals presented him with selective information. They showed him the future, but they weren't necessarily telling him the truth. And so it wasn't always clear whether it was in the past or the future or just made up. And so what the stones show, what Palantir is not showing, may be more important than what's selectively presented. So all of that's kind of a cautionary tale about what could be done or what should be done with that. But it is a reality, and it's one that I think we all need to worry about or think about as we're moving through the world. This screen's just showing you some of the relationship maps that Palantir offers and how this visual interface can link people to one another through their online presence or their database relationships. And this covers some of the issues that we've just spoken about. The other sort of X factor here is that COVID-19 has only increased the pressure for actionable intelligence by aggregating more and more data sources. And the company that the government has turned to help aggregate that data was actually Palantir, because they've got a lot of data and a lot of access to data. And so HHS rolled out something called Protect Now to aggregate 187 different data sources, including hospitals and both public and private. But it includes hospital capacity, PPE inventory, supply chain issues, diagnostic testing data, geographic testing data. And again, this can be a very powerful tool, but it also can pose a lot of risks about individual privacy and how that's done. So fighting back, I originally, we started doing this presentation back during the George Floyd protest, and I think I had in mind this notion of people really working for an expanded array of civil liberties. But we know from January 6th that not everyone's working for expanded civil liberties, and they're real threats to our democracy. So there are ways to combat surveillance and tracking, and I share those with you. But like everything else, they're neither good nor bad. It sort of depends on what you do with them and what cause you're fighting for. But let's get into some of what you can do in terms of mobile technology. So before you go to a protest, one of the things that you would want to do is enable full disk encryption. Now, iOS devices, Apple devices, have full disk encryption on by default. And every time that device is locked, it's very difficult to unlock it or de-encrypt it by law enforcement. But that's helpful to do if you have an Android device, because otherwise law enforcement can access that phone without any speed bump along the way. And you want to make that as difficult as possible to use. And for that same reason, you want to disable Face ID or fingerprint use on some of the older phones, because you do not want the law enforcement officer to hold up that phone to your face and unlock your screen and see who your last calls were, how long you've been, at that protest, and uncover all of your personal information and connections. Signal was mentioned at the last time. It also has a mobile app. It is an end-to-end encrypted messaging tool. It is very difficult to crack, has very little metadata, personal information about the who, what, why, when, where, the kind of to and from fields that's stored. It is a super powerful tool. It is fairly easy to use. You can download the app and you can communicate that way. I recommend it. So install it, use it before you even go to a protest. Another smart thing to do before a protest would be to turn off your notifications, because you hold up that phone. I know it's happened to me even during this call. You'll get notifications right there, texts from your friends, emails that are incoming, and that ray line or that clipped message could be incriminating. It could be compromising in some way that you don't want to share, or you just may want to keep that private. Turning off your notifications is a pretty good idea. Back up your data. Do that too. Your phone could get lost, it could get taken, it could get stolen. Be a really good idea to back it up. One other thing, we spent a little bit of time at the outset talking about mobile technology. The mobile carriers will always have your best and most accurate location data. Putting that thing into airplane mode will really prevent, it's essentially putting that phone in a box, and it's not allowing anyone to track you during the time while you're out in the world. And that airplane mode will really help in terms of preventing the triangulation from the base stations, because that signal is off. You're not going to connect to the Wi-Fi because, again, you've essentially turned it into a brick. The downside, of course, is you can't coordinate with friends and engage with them that way, but it is a very safe way to go and could be very helpful. Another way that you might be able to stay in touch with folks but not expose yourself to as much scrutiny would be to use a prepaid phone. In most states, you don't need an ID to buy a prepaid phone. You can, it depends on where you are, but in a lot of areas, you can just go into a small store or even a kiosk and buy one. It'll have, loaded up with $20, $50, and you're going to be covered for a pretty good amount of data and voice communications. And you can establish your networks that way. And at the end of it, it's essentially a disposable phone that you can get rid of after the protest is complete. And again, very difficult to trace because you've not given your ID. They don't have a billing address. They don't have information that can be tied back to you. Now, if you start not using things like Signal, or you start using your own Gmail address or other information, you're going to you've reestablished that personal connection. But if you use good data hygiene when you're using that prepaid phone, you can preserve your anonymity that way. Okay, during a protest, what do? First, you don't drive if you can help it, because you've got license plate readers, and those go into that Palantir database. And now we know, hey, you were headed to the protest, or now we can verify that path. And it's not all that difficult if you think about a sophisticated multi-database search along the lines of a Google search to get at that information. Another thing, don't wear your Viking horns and naked chest. You want to wear nondescript clothing when you go to a protest, because these identifying features will make it much easier to track you and trace it back to your online presence, your social media accounts, what have you. Same principle goes to cover, any identifying features. So, the mask, the sunglasses is actually pretty effective. It's harder to cross-reference individuals when their faces are obscured. So there's even, and this is going to sound weird, but there are glasses that you can buy online that reflect camera light back into the camera. And it sounds like that would never work, but it actually does. And it makes the camera a little bit, the image a little bit more grainy and a little bit harder to recognize. And so it's a surprisingly effective tool. It's one that folks don't usually like to talk about, though. One thing that doesn't work, I mentioned the license plate readers on the car. There are these sprays that you can put over the license plate reader. They're supposed to do the same thing that the glasses do and reflect light back onto the license plate reader. They don't work. There are a million online accounts where people are complaining about them constantly. They're just not reflective enough, and the cameras that are installed are usually sophisticated enough to filter out the image. And after all, it really is just kind of a black and white 1 and 0 type of imagery as opposed to nuanced facial recognition. And so the data's imagery is easier to capture. The cameras are usually better. The lighting's typically good, and the sprays don't really offer you much protection. Okay, so keep going here. All right, so after the protest is done, what can you do? Well, use some good internet hygiene. We talked a little bit about this, but use a strong password. Don't use the same password for every account. It's a temptation because there's too many darn passwords to remember, but really think about using different passwords for every service that you have, and enable two-factor authentication so that you get or are required to enter a number that's sent out to your cell phone or some other source, so that you can have that extra layer of security and affirmation that it is you, in fact, that is accessing this data. As our last speaker said, watch out for attachments. It's the root of all evil. You really need to be careful about any unexpected links or attachments. And you need to use a good antivirus software, keep your software updated. Now, when you get back, you'll probably want to share that photo of you at the protest. Scrub the metadata before you share your photo. It's a couple of clicks, but take off the location, the time information, other identifying factors, because that metadata will trace it right back to you. And that if you've used, you might have had the phone in airplane mode, but if you upload that image will have metadata that captures the time it was taken, the GPS coordinates of where it was taken, and other critical information that's traceable back to you. And you've just destroyed all of the anonymity that you worked so hard to achieve by, going out and buying that disposable prepaid phone. Another good idea just generally would be to use end-to-end encryption. That's, again, when you get back and you're communicating with your friends or family, it's using an app like Signal as opposed to something like regular Outlook email, so that you can really stay ahead of prying eyes that might otherwise, make your image, make your information available. Okay, so got a couple of closing thoughts, and then I think we're going to have a few minutes for questions. Technology has some limits. There are important limits because your GPS coordinates are only accurate to a degree, but it is getting better and better. And there are countermeasures that you can take that are pretty simple in a lot of respects, that don't necessarily require a whole lot of technical sophistication, but you do require a little bit of forethought before you go into a protest and while you're there. The real risk, I think, is big data, and how anonymization is really difficult, because just moving through the world, you're leaving all kinds of breadcrumbs on how to find you. And so there are real challenges, and I don't think any of these measures are really a replacement for getting at things like a good public policy around informed consent, a good public policy around disposing of information, and creating some kind of ethical oversight framework for that. But unfortunately, we live in this world, we live in a surveillance world, and we have to move through it, because we don't have the luxury of waiting until we've figured out all of those measures that might safeguard that data. So we've got to participate in that process. But while we're building that broad coalition of stakeholders to push a public dialogue about big data and motivate action, there are these practical things that you can do to protect yourself. So let me stop there. I think there are a couple of questions in the chat. That a little bit more broadly, and I'm happy to take questions. I can't promise I'll have all the answers, but I'm happy to try, and I can take back questions and follow up as needed. So I don't know what the best way, whether Tim or Courtney want to field the questions, or I should, maybe I can take it off share here so I can see everybody a little bit better. But I'm happy to field those now.
Yeah, and let us know if you have questions. Everybody is on, it's a regular Zoom, so you can jump in on audio, on video. Trey, thank you for the great session while we're waiting for questions to come in. I think you could write a book on everything you've discussed here today. You should write a book, probably. It'll be a bestseller. I like it was something along the lines of, for geofencing, it was like deeply disturbing yet extremely helpful. Looking at the privacy concerns versus the usefulness for, voter registration. It's a kind of apropos to like technology in the 21st century for sure.
It's definitely a double-edged sword, Tim, and I think that's really important because a membership-driven organization probably should be using geofencing to target their members if they're really aggressive about recruitment or get out the vote measures. If there are specific communities that are, for instance, there's been so much voter suppression legislation that's gone on. If you know that ballot boxes or remote drop boxes are being moved or only available at certain times, maybe it's a really great strategy to identify those people in that area and say, hey, your local drop box is now at this address rather than this old address, or there's only one box available rather than 4. So that's the thing about all of this technology. It's not inherently good or bad. It's really the purposes to which you put it. And we know that law enforcement is definitely pushing hard on these technologies. Both parties, actually, Republicans and Democrats, are using these technologies for get out the vote, for voter registration. Not taking advantage of them in some ways is tying your hands behind your back, but engaging with them may leave you morally compromised. I think that is the crux of the problem.
So Trey, I have one question and one comment. The comment is these are some fantastic suggestions for security at protests. Thanks for sharing. I know that Kade mentioned some of these in the earlier presentation, but what encrypted tools would you recommend for people? These are like smaller organizations joining us today.
Yeah, so the one that I think works really well and the one that I got on my own phone is Signal, because it's very easy to use. There are several others, and you'll be prompted to download all of them when you search for Signal. But that's the one that I'm most familiar with, and that's the one that I would recommend to folks. Trying to think of a few others off the top of my head. I would limit it to that, just rather than try to give you random ones, because there's a whole small ecosystem of those. But they tend to get pretty wonky pretty fast. So there's something called Tor, which is an open source service that can mask your identity and hide your identity from mass surveillance. I don't think it's all that easy to use, but it's out there. So I think there are a lot of measures that you can use that are a little bit more user friendly, and I think Signal is one of them. And you're on the case there, Tim, with the link. So you're one step ahead of me. That's great.
No, sorry, I'm trying to go back and forth.
No, it's really good. It's really good. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has actually done a lot of great work here, and they've put together a lot of resources where they'll give kind of a consumer reports edition of different types of services and sort of rated on usability and the level of protection or encryption that it offers. So I'd refer you to the Electronic Frontier Foundation and some of their really comprehensive work in this space to give you a good review of what's out there.
Hey, Trey, you mentioned you were talking about end-to-end encryption and strong passwords, and what are your thoughts on? I mean, should everybody have two-factor authentication set up? Should they use password safes or anything like that? What do you recommend?
Absolutely.
Everything, all the above.
All of the above. Yeah, I mean that's the thing. Like so many of these things, it's really easy to work yourself into the you'll run out of red yarn, tying all the links together, just in terms of the conspiracy theories that can go out there. I think by and large, it's most of the time there should be no reason to worry about these types of things. But unfortunately, we live in a world where you never know when you're going to want to remain anonymous. And so the smaller your footprint is in the online world and in the mobile world, the more anonymous you will be and the harder it is to trace you. And the more secure your communications, both in mobile and in a fixed line of communication, the smaller your footprint, and then therefore the harder it will be to go back and build your profile and establish your identity and your practices and proclivities. And so I would, across the board, it's just good to take that extra heartbeat and apply use the slightly less convenient tool, or establish that, take that extra second to enable encryption on your Android phone, or use an iPhone, which has a little bit higher level of security and privacy built in, so that you can husband your online identity and really share it only with those people that need to know it, or you want to share it with, rather than having the world just be able to act even more against your identity. I think it's just moving about the world. You're not going to avoid a license plate reader, a toll booth photo camera, street surveillance. It's just out there, and all of that is nothing that you can really do anything about on a day-to-day basis. What you can do, though, is to prevent your phone, your personal identity from being associated with that imagery, so that could be backward traced to a whole pattern of behavior over time. And so taking those steps across the board is just a matter of good internet hygiene.
And earlier in the presentation, you talked about the IMSI catchers, I believe, and
Right.
stingrays. And, is that something that's going to be around with us for a long time? You said that, like with 5G, that's no longer an issue, maybe, but I mean, obviously that's like far in the future. Not everybody's going to have that.
Yeah, like all of these technologies, they're not standing still. So the surveillance technologies are not standing still either. And so, in fact, the original technologies were developed for 2G networks, and most of those have been rolled out. But the shut down. The 3G networks now are being shut down, but they're still out there. And the stingrays have advanced with that technology. So there are these much more robust encryption levels at 4G and 5G, because they anonymize that identifier. But there's a security researcher, a guy named Roger Precautions, who found that 4G authentication doesn't actually occur until after the phone has revealed its IMSI number. So it establishes the connection, and then it encrypts everything. So that kind of opening means that stingrays can still grab the data before the phone determines it's not communicating with an authenticated cell tower. So it gets that little blip, and now it knows that, okay, that's that phone, that's Tim's phone. So yeah, you'll have a little less visibility. And then they could, of course, once they know that, they could potentially knock you down to a 3G network, grab your data off of that much less encrypted platform that way. And so 5G, there's a researcher who's done some things out of, actually it was a team, I think, from Purdue and University of Iowa. They found a way to guess an IMSI number without actually needing to decrypt it. So it's not foolproof at all. And it is something that I think it's about building up walls of defenses, as opposed to finding that kind of silver bullet, I only need to get a 5G phone. No, you should have a 5G phone, but you need to watch it to make sure that you're not down converted to a lesser standard. Then you should authenticate, and you should probably use Signal, and you should guard your online presence and identity throughout the process, because nothing is foolproof.
One question I have is, if you're following all the rules and you actually have really great complicated passwords for everything that you have, like, how do you manage that? practically speaking, because it feels like you either need to like write it down or store it in your phone and then do something that defeats the whole purpose of having these complicated passwords in the first place. Like, I don't know how to manage it all.
There are password managers out there, but I'm a skeptic, and so I don't use them. I do have a document that I keep 100 different passwords, and it's a nightmare. And I live in fear of losing that document. But I take comfort in knowing that it doesn't have an online presence, and it's not out there in the world, and so that those passwords are unique to me, and they're my family is very frustrated because the Hulu password or whatever seems to get changed all the time because I'll forget it and then I have to reset. But I just keep scratching them out and adding to it. So I am totally open to ideas. It is a great problem, but I'm reluctant to put the passwords out in the online world because I feel like they're vulnerable. I don't feel great storing them in hard copy, but I feel like that's a more secure kind of air gapped technology that they can't, no one can really get to. With all of these things, there is this I don't know, compromise between what's rational and what's absolutely paranoid. So it's about navigating that boundary for yourself as to what's practical and realistic. But it is for me, that's how I approach it.
What about when your iPhone or Chrome will recommend a password for you, and it's it's always a crazy password that's so long? Do you recommend people say, okay, and that I think, and then the way it works is either Chrome remembers it, or I think on my cell phone sometimes like it's connected to my face, the biometric, so that the biometric unlocks it. But is that more secure or somehow making it less secure? I'm not even sure.
Yeah, it depends. The terms of that is only as good as the policy terms of the provider, and then those policy terms are subject to change. So it should be fairly robust, and most of the policy terms are great, but those terms can be changed at the whim of the provider, and they often are. And that's the 7-page agreement that you sort of scroll through and click accept. You're sort of buying into whatever that policy is, and whatever it happens to be 6 months from now or a year from now. So I do like the randomly generated passwords because they're combinations that I wouldn't come up with myself, and usually they involve a bunch of ampersands and other strange characters that provide an additional layer of protection. However, you're dependent on Google or Apple or whoever maintaining the confidentiality of that password and doing so into the future indefinitely. So I'm not sure if it's foolproof. So again, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you, Courtney.
I know, it's so complicated. The other thing, I worked for the federal government for a little bit, and just in that short time, all of my information got hacked. And so I, of course, they notified me and signed me up with one of those groups that monitors everything about your online presence for 10 years for free. But it's so interesting because now, in addition to checking credit, if anyone applies for something in my name, I actually get notifications when anything associated with me is sold online. So I'll get a notification and I'll go to it and I'll see like my Gmail address was sold, and I can see that, and it happens like once a month. And I always think, well, I don't really know what to do about this. Like, people are just selling my email address. And sometimes it's associated with my address, or sometimes it's associated with where I work. And there doesn't seem to be like anything you could do about it, but it's just so crazy to kind of know it and think like, okay, I don't know if these are like third parties that have license with someone, some company I was shopping with or whatever, but it's just crazy to have access to it and kind of be aware that our information is getting traded like that out there on the web.
Yeah, one of the things that many of my friends do, I should probably do more of myself, is for every store, that wants your email to get the special 5% off or the discount or the whatever, have a separate email that really just focuses on, that's your sort of phantom identity, and then save that other, email address, your other, some other account for actual communications, so that you can always dive into that one. So I think one way to handle it would be to have multiple addresses and then have one that is more public and one that's more private. But I think throughout, you've got to guard your personal identity, because the fear, the worry is, but the more that you expand access to that identity, the more you empower those who want to aggregate the data and really create a vivid portrayal of how you move through the world.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw a recommendation once that said, have a separate email address and then put your name when you sign up as like whatever the company is. So I could put my name as Ann Taylor on the listserv. And then when you get an email to that account from Old Navy or Banana Republic, and it's like, hello, Ann Taylor, you kind of like, you already know who sold your information to those other people. And I was like, oh, that's a lot of effort, but some people are that committed to knowing who's doing what.
Absolutely.
I have one question. So would you suggest sign up for accounts, would you suggest logging through Google or just creating an account from the beginning?
What are you trying to do?
So like, say if you're trying to sign up for, I don't know, like Facebook or a Netflix account, and they ask if you want to sign through Google, like, would you suggest signing through Google or would you want to start another account?
I would not sign through Google. I would not sign into Facebook. It sort of depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to, if you're engaging in civil protests, you may not want to create a very large Facebook identity, because it's going to be really easy to track your activities back through Facebook. I mean, that's how they rounded up all the Capitol protesters from January 6th. They had these huge, Facebook identities. Like, it didn't require any of the fancy technologies we're talking about here. They just looked at this guy, looked at his Facebook profile. They're all videoing themselves, and then you trace that back to their Facebook accounts. It's really very straightforward. But I do worry when you rely on Google to authenticate, or Amazon to authenticate, or Apple to authenticate, you're empowering Apple to follow you, or Google to follow you across multiple sites. And we talked a little bit about Palantir. The way that technology becomes more powerful is when you begin to aggregate disparate bits of information from across the web, disparate sources. And so the more that you use one service to authenticate multiple interactions on the web, the easier it is for that service provider to track you and create a profile and get information about your likes and dislikes and your activities. And so that is, I think, a real source of concern, and should be for you and for anyone really. Plug in my computer here, it's about to die. Just realized it wasn't plugged into the wall. But in any case, it is a serious problem when you rely on one authentication method, because you're empowering that data. In fact, there's a big hullabaloo going on right now between Roku and Google. And Google runs YouTube, and it's really about the dispute is not so much over money, but about who controls the eyeballs of whose login will take precedence do you log in separately to YouTube, or are you able to log into Roku and then see YouTube through that channel? So these rights are very valuable, and you should be deliberate about who you give them to. Sort of, who do I trust to help me navigate the world? But I wouldn't rely on one service if you can tolerate it. I would really establish a one-on-one relationship to try to keep the data separate and segregable.
Yeah, and there was a comment that came in from Brad saying he used the car share app Get Around last weekend, and the only verification option was through Facebook, which he had deactivated months ago. So it definitely ties into that.
Absolutely. But you know, that car share app, there was no other way to use the app but for Facebook? I mean, that's incredible. Usually you're allowed to authenticate through
email or something.
Yeah.
No, I double checked. I Googled it and I looked online on just trying to see if there was any other way around it. And currently the way the app is designed, the only verification process, even though they already verified my Gmail information, the only verification that they would allow me to use was my Facebook information.
Wow. Yeah, well, there's a whole other debate going on about whether big tech has too much power, and you know, that's beyond the scope of this one. But that suggests that, yeah, maybe there's something to that.
All right, Trey. Well, I think we're about out of time. Any final thoughts you have? Really appreciate you coming back. I think this is your third visit to the Road to Equal Justice, so really appreciate your time for that.
No, I'm really glad to chat with you all. I think it's, you know, I think there's a lot of things that we can do, but I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I'm really grateful for your prior guest from the ACLU, because we've got to do some forward thinking, and it does require a lot of community building and engagement with these issues and foresight. But I think, unfortunately, we're already behind in terms of the protections and safeguards we need. And so as we move about the world, we need to think about trying to minimize our digital footprints and jealously guard our information and our relationships with different parties to make sure that we complicate and delay the ability of commercial or government actors to track our identities and our personalities and preferences online.
That's great, Trey. Well, have a good weekend, and thanks for joining us. Really, really do appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you.
So helpful.
Sure.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
And we have a couple minutes before our next speaker joins us from Witness. So I wanted to share in the chat window the application for the groups here in Boston. We're going to have some that are outside of Boston joining us in just a second. But we have a small grants program. Obviously, it's not very much money. It won't get you very far, but it's a $2,000 grant, a very easy application, I have to say. And this will jumpstart some ideas, some short-term projects, some, you know, if you've seen anything that might be of interest in here that you'd like to try, security data from the weeks before, or media strategies. You can apply this to existing projects to boost your tech skills. You can start new projects, short term, you know, a month or two for these projects. And we are accepting applications all the way up until June 11th, and we'll let everybody know June 18th who's got that. And we'll send it back out through email as well. So it's noon. It's great. We're on time. I'm going to turn it over to Kade to introduce this next section. And yeah, thanks everybody for hanging in there.
Hi, everybody. May 25th marks the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis that sparked national and global protest. Eyewitness video of his death not only ensured the conviction of his killer, but also changed the world in which we live. This reminded us that video recordings are ubiquitous tools that can be used to expose and disrupt injustices around the world. We wanted to invite some of our past organizations from the Road to Equal Justice to join us for our next session. Pinheiro will be joining us from Witness to discuss strategies for using video and technology to protect and defend human rights and empower communities. After Izzy's presentation, we will have a conversation moderated by Courtney Caruso from Hogan Lovells. So get your questions and thoughts ready. Thanks again, Courtney, for joining us today. Please take it away.
Great, thank you, Kade. And thank you, Isabel, or Izzy, for joining us this morning, or I guess it's almost afternoon now. So as we've heard, Witness is an international nonprofit organization that helps people use video and technology to protect and defend human rights. So we've been talking a lot about data and technology today, and right now we're going to shift to the power of the people and the use of data and technology and videos in the hands of the people. So I'm going to hand it over to Izzy, who can tell you a little bit about Witness and give us a presentation about the power of technology and video when we use it to defend and disrupt injustice.
Thanks so much for this introduction. And I also have been getting notifications that people are in the waiting room, and I just wanted to check that I'm not the only person getting those. And okay, great.
It's a host thing, and we'll take care of that. Thanks, Izzy.
Great. Thank you so much. So I will jump into this presentation and share my screen. And I'll also be sure to share this presentation afterwards, because there are some hidden gems of slides that we'll skip for the sake of time, and some links and more resources that are embedded in this presentation. Okay. So can everyone see the screen? Yes, okay. Today, we're going to be talking about the power of eyewitness video, and this is really a collaborative space. So if there's any comments that you have, I'm not able to see the chat at the moment, but I'll be so happy to join into that discussion when we have the time for questions, and to follow up with any of you after this presentation too. Okay. So today we're going to cover an intro to Witness and the landscape that we work in, how to film for community defense and justice with a focus on police violence, forced evictions, and incidents of hate, in particular facing Asian American Pacific Islander communities right now in the US. So also how to store and share these videos to make an impact.
Hey, Izzy, your presentation, the whole screen is not showing.
The whole screen is not showing?
The bottom part is cut off.
Oh. Better?
Yep, there you go. Thank you.
Thanks, team. Okay. So first, since we are a video organization, I will share this 2-minute video that gives an overview of Witness's work and can ground you a little bit more in who we are and why we do what we do. Sound?
Oh, there's no sound.
Cambodia, where the government has bulldozed and destroyed entire communities for profit. As thousands of people continue to fight for their homes, Bore exposes the truth behind their struggles. Meet Bukeni. Bukeni filmed children as young as 8 years old who were robbed of their childhoods and forced to become soldiers in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Bukeni's footage and advocacy helped convict militia leader Thomas Lubanga of war crimes. Lubanga is now behind bars. This is Laura. Laura helped expose the mass killings and disappearances of Mexican women and girls, whose only crime was to have been born female. Laura's story of one woman forced authorities to recognize widespread violence and to work towards a day when women don't just disappear. Mary first picked up a camera at age 60. She interviewed older men and women who suffered abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and put faces and voices to a silent crisis. Mary's interviews helped pass landmark legislation to protect vulnerable older Americans. Raja supports citizens and journalists in the Middle East who put themselves in danger to capture scenes like this one in Syria. Raja connects activists with resources they need to document the turbulent around them more safely. These activists have turned us all into witnesses. Many risk their lives to share these stories. But to honor their courage, we must do more than just witness. Join us to create a global community of activists. Help us fight human rights abuses throughout the world. Help us expose the truth, one video at a time.
So as you saw in that video, Witness supports communities to use video, tech, and storytelling to expose injustice. We support activists, journalists, lawyers to use video, which these days is often just the cameras in your pocket, to expose these abuses, hold governments accountable, and generate community power. We work across the world in different regions, and our team leads are deeply rooted in the places where we work. This is from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, Africa, as well as Latin America, Brazil, and the US. I am the Global Engagement Associate for Witness, and also one of the 2 people on our US team. And our work in the US focuses on immigrant justice, ending police violence, and decarceration, through our legal video advocacy program. Other areas of our work that tie in with these include archiving and databases, and we have separate resources and programs around things like Indigenous rights. I can share links to some of these specific projects that some which are not covered in this presentation if it's really pertinent to any of your work and you're interested. Okay. So this is getting to that landscape piece that I talked about in the beginning. A lot of us know really personally how video and tech shape daily reality, and this is true in different respects for communities all over the world. These numbers shed just a fraction of light on this. And so even though it's easier for people to document abuse because of, and to also witness it either through social media or through some of the campaigns that communities are leading to expose abuse, a lot of times the video that people initially take lacks crucial details and can't be used as evidence, or sometimes they are never really making it out to the public because they are deleted or confiscated or lost. And so we are working to help ensure that more videos does equal more justice, because we know that visibility is a stepping stone for all other human rights. This is just a reminder that we are all coming into this with a lot of different experiences, and some of that includes trauma and fear around some of the very human rights abuses that we'll be focusing in on. And the goal of this session is not to stoke paranoia, it's to build power and remind ourselves that we are powerful, we have these networks that we're creating in spaces like these, and that with the knowledge and skills that we exchange, that we have the ability to grow more powerful in our resistance. So with that, we'll pivot into the first section of this workshop in talking about using your camera to film police. And this slide has the link to the project page for the US, so you can get some of these more tailored resources. This quote is something that captures what a lot of communities know all too well. The violence is not new, it's the cameras that are new. And this is from Ta-Nehisi Coates. We saw this recently, as alluded to in the opening, how much video was used in the Derek Chauvin trial for the killing of George Floyd, which Darnella Frazier had bravely filmed, and she was 17 years old at the time, and traumatized through the experience. And so when we look at video, we see how it can be critical for accountability in the courtrooms, and also how video and the mobilizations that are sparked in mass civil rights movements like Black Lives Matter shape so much discourse and action, both online and offline. And taking a step back from this, we see across the board how eyewitness video amplifies critical stories, can help people forward their calls for justice, and strengthen court cases, and mobilize people to take actions in demonstrations of global solidarity. And we see that to this day with the Black Lives Matter movement. So we also see the challenges of video, and this is the risks that come with filming, the risks that come with sharing, the trauma that gets perpetuated in the ways that this footage is shared or used. And in addition, the ways that the reforms that are implemented in response to the amplified calls for justice are often hollow. And one of these hollow reforms that I'll zoom in on is police body cameras. The main takeaway from this slide is that they are not a solution to police violence, even though they have been adopted across the US, and that other countries are also beginning to have this conversation. And so some of the information here is to help you all bust these myths when it might come up in conversations or in some of the advocacy that you are doing. Police body cameras do not increase transparency. And one of the reasons for this is that transparency can't happen without good policies. And most body cameras in police departments are adopted without any policies at all for how they are used or managed and how the public might be able to access that footage, or the policies that are adopted limit the ability of families, of lawyers, of the public to be able to see the footage of misconduct. We've seen this over and over again, and sometimes the struggle has so many obstacles that it even makes headlines. And two cases that I can point to for this are Daniel Prude's killing in Rochester, New York, and most recently with Andrew Brown Jr. being killed in North Carolina. Both of these incidents were really egregious, had footage of the incident from body cameras, and families really struggled to access it, and judges even upheld the police's ability to keep that footage from being seen by the families or by the public, except in censored or edited bits. The next is that body cameras also are not a neutral technology. They do not provide a neutral narrative. One reason for this is the ways that the footage can be used for something that is called propaganda, which is essentially media that promotes pro-cop sentiments and aims. And we see how police will quickly release body footage if they think it supports their narrative, but then how they set up these obstacle courses, like what I was just diving into a little bit. Police are also able to review the footage before they write their reports, and this allows them to create a narrative that frees them from blame. And when they're actually using the body cameras, they are often turned off, they're turned away from the incident as it's happening, or we've seen officers narrate what's happening off screen in a misleading way. They're also not a straightforward or efficient technology, namely they are costly. And this cost is the increased militarization of police, that this is a part of the larger trend of the increased surveillance of BIPOC communities, as well as the monetary cost that it is pretty astronomical for managing the footage that comes out of these. Like it's massive amounts of data. And all of this is borne by taxpayers and not the police departments themselves. Lastly, they do not make officers behave better. At best, these studies are mixed and inconclusive. And there are studies that show they have no effect on officer behavior or on the likelihood of there being disciplinary action taken. So we know that the stakes are much too high to be calling for a reform that we know doesn't work and exacerbates existing issues. Our response to this is to uphold and use our right to record, because where the footage of violence comes from and who has ownership over it matters. So if civilians are able to safely record police abuse and know what to do with that footage, then we can have that transparency and access to these patterns that body cameras purport to offer. So now we'll go into how do we use this right to record police. All of these steps are something that I'll go into in the following slides. Starting with step one, which is to prepare. Part of preparation is knowing your rights. This can be helpful for your emotional or psychological safety, and also help you more skillfully navigate the situation to legally protect yourself. Still important to center that knowing your rights and using your rights doesn't mean that you're going to have those rights be respected by officers, and that this risk is contingent on things like your perceived race, class, ability, and a host of other things. So you do have the constitutional right to film police in public as long as you don't interfere. And this is specific for the US. The definition of interference is up to the police officer. So know that as you go into the situation and assess your own safety. Remember that filming is not always the best option, and that no footage is ever worth your safety or the safety of others. We know that filming can de-escalate a situation, but it can also make you a target of aggressive officers or stoke fear in the person who is facing abuse when they see a camera being pulled out. So you want to film clearly and openly. This is both for the person who is experiencing the abuse and to kind of protect yourself so that it's not said that the officers thought that you had a weapon. And if you feel comfortable, assert your rights by saying something like, I have the right to document this interaction, or I'm not interfering, I'm just observing, if police are trying to tell you to stop recording. If you're told to back away, that is an order to comply with, and you can take a few steps back and even turn your camera down to your feet to show yourself backing up if you're able to take the camera away from the situation without losing valuable information. And although law enforcement is not able to confiscate your phone without a warrant or court order, or to delete your footage, even if they do have access to your phone, we have seen that they do this when they are caught on camera. So that brings us to the other part of preparation, which is digital security and preparing your phone. This is important for yourself, and also remembering that digital security is a community safety issue. There are a bunch of people that are connected through your phone, through your contacts, through the media that's on there. So their safety is contingent on the practices that you put in place. One of our top recommendations for this is to have a 6-digit passcode on your phone. It's one of the most secure ones. It's harder to hack if your phone does get confiscated by law enforcement, and it offers you more legal protection because it is protected under the Fifth Amendment, which gives you the right to not give access to a password or PIN code that might lead to information that incriminates you. But courts have ruled both ways on whether this right extends to Face ID, to Touch ID, and to pattern lock. You also want to back up your footage by having a cloud service turned on, and do your research on what cloud service is going to be the best option for you, because some are more vulnerable to hacking than others and also have histories of giving data to authorities. So you want to weigh the risks and benefits. You want to pay attention to your storage capacity and to your battery, and also make sure that you have the legal contact in your phone in case anything happens. And this is the National Lawyer Guild's hotline number that you can always use and turn to. Okay, so step 2 is then, how do we actually film the police and put this right to record into action? One of the most important things to keep in mind is to film continuously as soon as you feel like it's safe to do so. A lot of instincts are to start filming as soon as something violent is happening, but if you see that someone is being pulled over by the police or that something is happening and you do your own risk assessment, that is a good time to pull out your phone because it will be more valuable to a lawyer. And you also want to make sure to film continuously because it makes your footage more credible and less likely to be facing claims that it's been manipulated or edited in a misleading way.
Izzy, we have a request for you to show that number again.
Yeah.
Do you mind putting it back up? I can put it in the chat.
Sure. And again, I'll send out this presentation too, so you'll have all of this information.
Great, thanks.
Of course. Okay. So next is to hold shots and have steady pans to make sure that your footage is as usable as possible. And this is something that is often really hard to do in the moment, especially when there's a lot of emotions and anxiety and frantic energy around. Using your elbows as a tripod by holding them against your body as you're filming can help you stabilize that footage. And you can make the choice based on whatever the situation is to film horizontally or vertically. Either option works as long as it captures the most relevant information for whatever you're trying to prove with your footage. Getting a variety of shots is also really important and helpful, and this is most easily done when you're working with a team or a partner. So you can talk about what kinds of shots you're both trying to get. Wide scenes are good to get wide shots are good to get a sense of the whole scene, and close-up shots are good for details, and 360 also help you build a sense of what are all of the different things that are going on at this time and who is there. We also recommend to focus your camera on the law enforcement agents and not on the people who are being abused, and recognize that this is often a really hard tip to put into practice, but just to be mindful that like they're the people that you're trying to expose, and trying to limit the amount that the footage being shared could be re-traumatizing for that person is a part of where this guidance comes from. Okay, so when it comes to what to film, you want to think like a storyteller or a journalist, and that goes back to answering the questions of who, what, where, and how. Who is something that you can capture by filming some of these different elements. A really helpful thing is to read the badge numbers or their names out loud, because sometimes, depending on what is happening in the footage, it can be harder to get that from a screen grab later. You also want to think about how to film where and when, and this is really important for helping to prove that your footage is real. And this is especially true for marginalized communities whose accounts of abuse are often discredited, and having the visual cues for location, time, and date can really help people, can really help with your case for credibility that might otherwise be under fire. If you feel comfortable, you can say the time and date out loud. If you're okay with your voice being on video, you can also write it on a piece of paper or do things like filming your phone screen. When capturing where something is happening, just be really mindful if it's going to be exposing the personal identities of the person who was facing abuse, and give cues as to where they might live and put them at further risk if this video is shared publicly. This risk is less high if you're doing something like sharing it with a lawyer or an advocacy organization. When it comes to what and how, these details help you to tell the story of the footage, of your footage, and think about, if you were not there, what would you need to know in order to tell that story of what happened. These things can help show the level of egregiousness, help build the narratives around how police were acting in this situation, if there was any lies or violence used. And if you don't feel safe filming in a moment, you can also film after the incident has passed and show damage done to the property, or film interviews with people that were there if you come up with an agreement on how that footage is going to be shared and used, and collect their contact information. Okay, really quickly, I'll touch upon live streaming because it is something that we, especially at protests, see people doing to garner more awareness and get more eyes on something that is happening. And this is something that comes with increased security risk, because you can't make some of those decisions in the moment as easily about safety and security concerns. And we've seen that live streams can be incriminating, and also know that police watch live streams, especially of highly anticipated actions. So if you are going to make the choice to live stream, some things to think about are just doing it to a private channel with some trusted viewers like lawyers or fellow advocates that need to know what is going on. Point your camera down to the floor if something incriminating is happening on screen, and also be mindful that it's really common for this kind of footage to be taken down. So you want to download the live streams, and this link on the screen has some different options so that you can do that and preserve the evidence that you capture. Okay, step 3, safeguarding your footage. This is often a piece of filming police violence that is often overlooked, but is really important. One of the things that we use is the 3-2-1 rule for file backups. That's making 3 copies, saving it on 2 different types of storage, like a hard drive and a computer, and having 1 copy be offsite so that all your copies aren't in the same physical location, which gives you some backup if something happens, like a natural disaster or a raid at one of the locations. You want to never edit the original file. This is really important for authenticating your footage, and this includes not changing the file name. So you can make a copy and change that file name, or organize footage by keeping them in folders. And social media is not an archive, so similar to live streams, if you have footage on YouTube or on social media, this is something that gets taken down a lot, especially with algorithms that are supposed to be taking down what is called anti-extremist content. But a lot of times activist footage gets caught in this net. So you want to make sure that you do what you can to preserve your footage. And often this means working with other people, because long-term archiving is something that takes a lot of resources, and is something that is most sustainably done as a group collective effort. So an example of how we have supported some grassroots organizations in the US that have built databases specifically for exposing police misconduct and pushing for accountability is with El Grito on the left, which is a New York City-based community organization working mostly in Asian and Latina communities to expose the police violence that is a daily reality for many folks, and it escalates around events like the Puerto Rican Day Parade each year. And on the right, we have Berkeley Cop Watch, which is also a community-based police monitoring organization in California. Both of these projects were low cost, accessible, and secure, and help to show systemic patterns of abuse and how entrenched violence is in certain police practices and departments. This is also speaking to some of the ways where archiving can help amplify a collection, and how a collection can tell a story more strongly than a single video. These projects led to the generation of resources like webinars and toolkits, data dictionaries, file templates for databases, and all of those things are things that you can find on each website. Okay, the last step in this process is thinking about what to do when it comes to sharing your footage. One thing, like every aspect of filming for video evidence and advocacy purposes, is that there are risks and opportunities that come at every step of the way. So when it comes to sharing, I'll illustrate 2 different cases of people who filmed police violence and use those to kind of talk about some of the different considerations to make. On the left, we have Ramsey Orta, who filmed Daniel Pantaleo killing Eric Garner in 2014. He, in response to this footage being released with his name, he had increased surveillance from the police. He was targeted by the cops. He ended up going to jail for a different charge, and he maintains that it was because he filmed the police that he was targeted. And when he was in prison, he also faced intimidation from the guards. His family was harassed, his house was raided, his family's social media accounts were hacked into. So there was a lot of backlash, and all that he has said about this process that he regrets is releasing the footage with his name. In contrast, we have Baden Santana, who filmed Michael Slager killing Walter Scott. And when he got this footage, he got in touch with a local Black Lives Matter chapter who put him in touch with the family. And they worked with a lawyer and a journalist on what to do with the footage. And after the police report of this incident was written up, 3 days later, they had on the front page of the New York Times the video of what had happened, which directly contradicted the police report where he had said that Walter Scott had tried to take his taser and that was an act of self-defense, and none of that happened. And when this video came out, Michael Slager was charged with murder and ended up being sentenced for 20 years, which is an extremely rare outcome in cases like these. And a lot of filmers are often aiming for disruption instead of justice because of how entrenched the problem of police impunity is. So whether you film police violence or any human rights abuse, the first thing that you want to do is pause and take a breath. This often means that you've just witnessed or directly experienced a traumatic or violent event. And what you want to do is take care of yourself, decompress, and get to a place where you can then think through some of the ways that you might want to safely share this footage and what the strategy might be around that. Some questions for thinking through that sharing strategy are considering the ethics, like, will this video re-traumatize anyone? Something that we recommend is when you have footage of police violence, try to let the person who was harmed or targeted know and be in control of how the footage is shared or not shared. And there are ways that you can try to get in touch via working with a local advocacy organization, as Baden Santana had with the Black Lives Matter movement, but there are other kinds of advocacy groups that are really embedded in the neighborhoods and places that they work in that might be able to support you with making that a more viable possibility. You also want to consider, as with what happened with Ramsey Orta, how posting the video might put you or others at risk, and what are the protective measures that you can take to mitigate that. So this might mean releasing the footage anonymously, or using different kinds of tools to scrub out identifying features of people in the footage. These are some tools that you can use for photos or for videos. And when you're using them, you want to make sure that you pay attention to not only scrubbing out people's faces, but any other identifying features like tattoos, or even we've seen authorities find people based on what they were wearing that was seen in the footage. So those are things you want to be mindful of. Next is timing. Sometimes it can be really strategic, as we saw in the case with Walter Scott, to wait until an official report or something like that is made, or there is a court case that opens up. Other times, in something like a protest that is having a narrative shaping as it unfolds, it can be really important to get the footage out as quickly as possible, especially if there's already a lot of media being shared around that. And then lastly is thinking about where you can share the video and who you can share it with. And our main recommendations are a trusted journalist, community organization, or lawyers. And this slide has some more links for the kinds of things you want to consider when having a conversation with journalists and how you can find them. Local journalists often are on Twitter and have their DMs open, but you can do your own research to see how they've covered issues like this and how they've maintained people's anonymity or what sort of lens they're using to report on police. The last element of sharing that I'll highlight is not only the trauma and risks that come for the filmer and person being filmed, which we've talked about, but also the trauma that comes with viewing footage like this. This BuzzFeed article that's highlighted on this slide is centering the voices of some Black teenagers in Minnesota and what the effect of seeing the constant circulation of Black death on social media is for them. Because essentially this normalizes and dehumanizes the attacks against Black people and turns trauma into something to be consumed. And something that I thought was really powerful that someone had shared in the article was Nicole Bosire, and she said, "It's like a foreshadow of your own death, and we are still so young." So this consideration is part of what makes the case for newsrooms and activists alike to be adopting practices like describing footage rather than posting it, including in a headline if the report does or does not contain the video footage, disabling autoplay of videos, and having content warnings before a video starts. And one other voice that I really want to add to this conversation, and there are links to her writing in the presentation notes, but is Dr. Alyssa Richardson, who connects the current ways where this media is consumed to the history of postcards of lynching and how these are both artifacts that need to be treated with reverence and a solemn reverence, and that this burden of proof being put on Black communities needs to be done away with, and that there needs to be a moratorium on news media broadcasting these and sweeping reform when it comes to police. Okay, so the next pivot that we'll do is into forced evictions, because there are some people that work in housing justice on this call. So hopefully this can be helpful. And of course, forced evictions often do involve police. So some of the content that we just went through will feed into this. Housing has for a long time been a pressing human rights issue in the US, and this has escalated during COVID. We've seen evictions happening even when there has been a moratorium because people either won't qualify or the landlord is just pursuing the eviction anyway. We also have seen in March how in LA and Echo Park, there have been forced evictions of unhoused people in preparation for the 2028 Olympics. And this is where some of our forced eviction works was kind of born from, was forced evictions in the name of development that came from our work in Rio when there was the World Cup in 2014 and the Olympics in 2016 that were causing people to be forcibly evicted. And the government was saying, this is not happening. People are getting adequate notice and resettlement. And we worked with partners and activists to connect the dots between these over 100 videos that were shared on YouTube of people showing what was happening to their homes or in their neighborhoods. And we verified and curated this footage in a project for a broader advocacy campaign. And that's, I'll show you one of the videos that was used in it so you can get a better sense of how using film can play out in fighting forced evictions.
Oh, I don't think there's any audio, is he?
I am not hearing it. Sorry, it's taking a bit to buffer on my end.
I have the honor to announce that the games of the 31st Olympiad are awarded to the city of Rio de Janeiro.
Casos de remoções que lembram práticas nazistas. A prefeitura veio aqui, marcou todas as casas com esse número. As casas marcadas são casas para sair. Veio ontem falando que a gente tem de quarta a sexta-feira para sair. Eles disseram que não ia esperar.
Quando eu comprei, já tinham arrancado tudo, pegaram aparelho caro dos outros.
Que sujeira, francamente, Eduardo Paz. A prefeitura já vem trabalhando há mais de um ano nas desapropriações. Isso aqui eram todas casas, prédios, comércios.
Digamos, abuso de poder.
Tratamos de fazer um trabalho com grande alcance social.
Então aqui morava uma família?
Morava várias. 36 anos que eu moro aqui.
Olha, aqui desde 87.
Comunidades vivem o pesadelo da remoção por causa da Copa do Mundo. Os moradores não querem sair para dar lugar a complexos esportivos para a Olimpíada, como previsto no projeto.
Onde ir? Acho que eu vou.
Meu barraco é pequeno, mas é meu! Eu não pedi paz nenhuma, não roubei, não! Isso aqui é meu! Ninguém vai me tirar daqui, não!
Nós vamos resistir. Se eles quiserem derrubar a casa da gente dentro, eles vão derrubar aqui. Pra quê? A gente tá vivo mesmo.
Okay. So one of the things about this project also is that it shows how videos can be useful because they are a source of data. The videos that were sourced for the video that you just saw were also analyzed to supplement key reports that were used in stakeholder meetings about the abuses that were proliferating during this period. This whole project led to the creation of a forced evictions toolkit that's available in 11 languages, in case that is useful for any of you to apply to your work. I'm not going to go through these next slides, just they're here as a resource for you to use, but this is from the toolkit, from one of the tip sheets about how to film before, during, and after an eviction. And one thing that I'll note is that you don't have to do a project as wide-reaching as what I had just shared. We have even, for example, in the last year or two, seen in the ways that someone who had experienced a forced eviction, the footage was shown to a basketball team because it was a team that the landlord was a big fan of, and they had this information somehow, and they got the basketball team to be making a public statement about the forced eviction. And so we can see how even just around an individual case, this putting pressure on specific people, the ways that you can use this footage without having a really extensive campaign. The next chapter of this workshop is using film to fight for Asian American Pacific Islander community safety. And these next couple of slides are both in honor of May being Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and also in recognition of the escalation of violence against this community that has been rising during COVID, but was a dark part of US history and recent history even before this. And this is also meant to elevate the work that impacted communities and their allies are doing to uproot this violence. This is an organization that is based in the US that I'll give a shout out to, called iHoloback, which gives trainings and is currently giving free training specifically for being an active bystander to AAPI hate. And they have 5 Ds of bystander intervention, and one of them is document. And some of the tips for filming incidents of hate are a lot like filming police violence. So I'll just, in these notes, you can see the specific tip sheet we have about filming hate and download that. And I'll underscore here that is the importance of consent and really honoring the person who has experienced this hate and seeing what would be most meaningful for them about how this footage is used and how you can support in that. The other piece of this is the role of video in community safety as an alternative to measures like calling the police. This banner in the slide reads, "The police do not protect us, we have to protect and support each other." And there have been a lot of people from the AAPI community that fear the police and face increased risk because of their race, their gender, their immigration status, the nature of their work. And there's also an acknowledgement that calling the police increases the police presence in communities and puts more Black people at risk of additional surveillance and imprisonment and other forms of state violence. So we've seen when it comes to this specific attention being put on AAPI hate, is that video is being used for people to tell their own story, is being used for national reporting. It's being used to also highlight the community initiatives, like in Oakland, what people are doing in getting companions for elders and having that be a way that people feel safer when they are out, and how video is being used to support those campaigns and to have people be able to tell their story and connect the dots between things that aren't caught on video. And the last note of this presentation is, after all of this, you've filmed the police or a forced eviction or an incident of hate, and now what? What are the ways that you can make this footage go further and really translate these stories of abuse and raw footage of violations into social change? And the answer, one of the answers to that is video advocacy. It's an audio-visual argument where video is the medium for the goal of change, and a really central part of video advocacy is having a call to action that strategically connects your audience to the change that you seek. And video is not a magic wand. Even at Witness, we really acutely know that. And it's something that has to be used alongside other organizing strategies like protests, petitions, and lobbying, and other creative things that people are coming up with to really drive this change forward. We have a bunch of video advocacy material online in our library that can help you think through audience and messaging and plan out a whole campaign. But some questions that I pulled out that are just about ethics, because risks occur when you film, when you distribute, and when you edit. And as a human rights advocate, one of our mandates is to do no harm and to recognize that you have a responsibility to the people that are filmed or the communities that are implicated in the video, the filmer or the sources that you get your footage from, as well as to your audience. So returning to some of these questions to make sure that you're upholding that ethical responsibility as you go throughout a video advocacy process is really important. And I've kept mentioning that, oh, something is really great and it's available in our library. This is linked to our library and it has free resources. You can download them, you can remix them, reuse them. They're all Creative Commons licensed. and there's 27 languages. So hopefully there's something available for you and the different communities that you might be working with. If you have any questions, my inbox is very open for follow-up, and the social media is listed for our global organization, but all of our regions also have their own specific social media channels that you can follow to be staying in the loop of things. And that is the presentation, and this is a link for the, oh, I'm not sure where the chat is. Oh, here it is. For the US newsletter, if anyone wants to stay in touch on specifically what we're doing.
Izzy, thank you so very much. This has been so interesting and informative and eye-opening in a lot of ways too. And for those who've been with us all morning today, I think we've heard a lot about the different ways that, you know, we are subject to technology and we're kind of like living in this surveillance state. And this has been really helpful about thinking through how we can kind of take control of that and work together to drive outcomes that we want to see. So I'll pause for a minute just to see if anyone has any questions, comments, reflections. Maybe it's not a comment, maybe it's just a statement of some kind of reaction to what you've heard. If anyone is feeling courageous or brave to share, I will pause and give an opportunity to do that. And if not, then I'll tune in a second for a follow-up question for Izzy myself.
I was just gonna say, Izzy, thank you so much for sharing all that. One part that when you talked about the BuzzFeed article and the younger generation asking not to share the video, this is something I discuss a lot with my colleagues about being intentional. If you've recorded video or you have access to video, not to share it for the sake of sharing it. Otherwise, you're kind of just helping people get used to Black and brown people and other people getting killed, and to be very intentional to translate that into some kind of action. So thank you for including that as part of your presentation. I think that's something that needs to be thought of more and not just used as a social media platform to get reactions from people.
Yeah, absolutely. And having that guiding question of why am I sharing a video is really important to make sure that you are, you know, not swayed by some of just what is the status quo and the norm that is really harmful and problematic. And it was really important for us to be having those conversations with people that we know to call attention to say, this is not how it should be, and it can be different. I definitely appreciate that share.
I totally agree with that point. I thought it was really important. So I have two questions coming out of it. One, does Witness or any other organization provide this kind of training for geared particularly to young people, like young adults, high school age, asking for all of my children? And second, are there organizations that you know of, Isabel, in the Boston area that actively work with, or maybe not even the Boston area, that actively work with people who have filmed things to put them in touch with family members or attorneys? I know you mentioned Black Lives Matter. Is that something that Black Lives Matter really does on a systemic basis, where maybe I could volunteer my time, for example, to help in that effort? Or are there other organizations that do that you know of?
That cut out a couple of different times, so I'll repeat what I pieced together and you let me know. You were asking if there was specifically any organization or work that Witness is doing related to young people filming things like these, and then the second question was not something that I picked up at all. Just know that there was something after that. Thank you for putting, okay, to educate them on how to use such films responsibly. Yeah, I something that I can send in the the follow-up with the presentation are some different organizations like Black Youth Project that are geared specifically for young people and make a lot of content. And I imagine that some of their work is specifically focused around how people can be thinking about how to personally take care of themselves when it comes to these videos. That there's also some blogs that we have that I can share that are from like Mike Brown's family and what his sisters were talking about the impact of the footage. So I think in general that showing people things like that BuzzFeed article, which weaves in people's voices, or the Witness blog post, to have that be a jumping off point for conversation for people to think about those considerations. Because a lot of the times when it also comes to ethics or things like sharing, there are some principles that you can have that are guiding, and a lot of things are not very clear on hard yes, hard no on what to do. So giving people the tools to be able to critically engage with the topic and to also prioritize the safety of themselves and their community in realizing just what the impact of things like this are is what I think is a really important part of those conversations.
Izzy, the other question was about organizations that are kind of connecting people who filmed with, you know, whether families or lawyers who can help make sure that that film gets to where it needs to be in a responsible way.
Yeah, there are a lot of organizations and a lot of, I think, local media groups that are having a lot of people who have anti-racist practices or trauma-informed practices will make this really clear. The Dartmouth Center for Journalism does a lot of work around specifically trauma and journalism, both on how to report on it and how to manage it, like as journalists who are often receiving a lot of footage or other kinds of accounts of people who have stories of trauma, and then they might experience vicarious trauma as a result of that work. So there are different kinds of organizations in the journalist sphere and lawyers who have an activist mandate, and it also gets more specific, like people that work with immigrants. There will be like the Immigrant Defense Project, and people who Witness does primarily deal with video, but we don't receive footage like what you're talking about and try to connect people to community members. All of those things, if the specific ask is around connecting families and having advocacy groups use these film responsibilities, is my suggestion would be to look locally and see what is being done there. And that's where I think you'll have also the greatest ease of access versus something like trying to volunteer with really huge organizations like the ACLU or people like that.
So we have just 2 minutes left. Is there any last comment or question?
Thank you so much to all the participants who asked questions, was very engaged during this panel, and to all the speakers, thank you, Witness. And please, everyone, don't forget to fill out the short application to receive the $2,000 tech grant. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Izzy.
Of course.
And thanks to everyone for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney, for moderating the panels, really, or not the panels, but the sessions. It was great having you.
Yeah, thanks PeaceTech team for making this so easy to do and for pulling out questions and making sure that there was support with the prep too. Really appreciate your support.
Yeah, thank you, Izzy. Appreciate your time.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thanks. This was awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.